Hello, welcome back. I'm Dr. Harriet Fraad.
And I'm Juliana Forlano, here with our podcast, Capitalism Hits Home.
This is a show about the intersections and mutual shapings of capitalism, class, gender, race, and every aspect of our personal lives, including our sexuality.
We aim to educate, activate, and even alleviate some of the burdens we all experience living in a capitalist USA.
We hope that this program serves you well. It's brought to you by Democracy at Work. Today, we are fortunate enough to have a guest, Kristen Ghodsee, who wrote this super book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. And it's important because it really exemplifies the intersections of the capitalist system with a very personal aspect of our lives, our sexuality. And we were so taken by that excellent book that we would like to speak with Kristen Ghodsee and ask you, Kristen, what are you attributing women's very well documented in this book, better sex under socialism, the state socialism of the Soviet bloc countries?
Yeah, so it's a really, it's not an easy soundbiteable question. And so oftentimes there are lots of confounding factors. And I've had this conversation with many readers in the United States, but also with many readers in Eastern Europe. I've been really lucky in that the book has had 13 foreign editions so far, and 5 of those editions are in the languages of these former state socialist countries. So I've been able to get a lot of feedback, not only from people in the United States, but from people in the region who lived this period of time. And that's been really enlightening for me personally. But I think that there are several key things that come up. The first is obviously the lack of religious dogma in these countries. Obviously, there was an official sort of state atheism in many places, and the reduction in the influence of religious institutions in daily life, whether they be churches or mosques, has a real important impact on the way that women's emancipation is formulated and pursued in society. So that's, an obvious thing. The other thing that I often hear about is that, of course, sex was better, relationships were better in state socialism because there was nothing else to do. So this argument takes 2 forms. One is a kind of nostalgic form, which is, well, they didn't have phones, they didn't have Netflix, they didn't have all these modern things that we have today. And so therefore, they had more time to, spend with to share with their lovers and their friends, and that made life better. But of course, 40 years ago in the United States or in Western Germany, they didn't have phones or Netflix either, and there was still a difference. So I don't put too much credence in that argument. But the other argument is that, a lot of women, I think there was a survey done by a British women's magazine that said more women would rather shop for shoes than have sex with their partners. And so if you have all these retail opportunities.
Okay, but wait, shoes are very important. I'm just saying.
Yes, no, but it was a very specific question. It was about shoes, which I thought was really funny. So, the argument goes, well, these societies had consumer shortages. Obviously, the public sphere was quite, constricted by the realities of life under authoritarianism. And so people really shared their time in a particular way in the private sphere. And this led to not only better sexual relationships, but also better interpersonal relationships between friends, between family members, between colleagues, and so on and so forth. So that's another set of explanations. And I think there's definitely something to that. But the argument that I really focus on in the book, and is the subtitle of the book, and other arguments for economic independence, has specifically to do with the ways in which these state socialist, what I call state socialist countries in Eastern Europe, invested very heavily in the emancipation of women, partially because they had severe male labor shortages in the Soviet Union after 1917 due to the First World War and the Civil War. And in Eastern Europe, the rest of Eastern Europe, after 1945 following the Second World War. But more importantly is that they also had a kind of theoretical grounding, socialist theories as they were articulated in Europe beginning in the early 19th century with people like Charles Fourier and Flora Tristan and Henri Saint-Simon, very much saw women's emancipation as part of the emancipatory project of socialism. And later you have people in Germany like August Bebel and Clara Zetkin, and in the Soviet Union, Alexandra Kollontai, writing about how the creation of a socialist economy not only would emancipate women by allowing them to participate, for instance, in the labor force, but very specifically would decommodify their sexuality so that women would no longer have to sell their sexuality on a marketplace. And once you decommodified human relationships, once marriage and love were decoupled from economic considerations, women would choose their partners. Now, of course, this is primarily talking about heterosexual relationships, but women would be able to choose their partners on the basis of love, attraction, and mutual affection, and not on whether or not your partner can pay your bills or pay your rent or put food on the table for your children. And so the minute you liberate you liberate human emotions and human relationships from economic considerations, you create a whole new way of interpersonal, of organizing your personal life with other people. And I think that what the state socialist countries allow us to do, the data that we have, and I have all sorts of figures that I can read later in the podcast, the key thing is that what Eastern Europe provides for us is a kind of empirical piece of empirical evidence. It's a natural experiment. We can compare the way that a group of women grew up under capitalism and another group of women grew up under socialism and ask them questions about their intimate and personal lives that show that there really is a qualitative and quantitative difference in the way that people interact with each other depending on the economic system under which they live.
Well, that's a really important thing. And I took the liberty of looking in the democratic socialist, half capitalist, highly regulated capitalist societies of the Sweden, Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, and Finland. And they reported the same things you did, that since women get support in childbirth, support as single mothers with children, and wonderful maternity leaves, and in some cases forced paternity leaves as well. Some of the countries do not allow men to escape from a paternity leave and therefore get some kudos at work. They have to take a paternity leave. That they too have a better sexual life because they're not worried about their sex being commodified because they need to live and they're systematically discriminated against in childcare, after school care, and jobs on the basis that they could get pregnant and lose and leave the job, and then they'd have to retrain someone. The government steps in and pays those leaves. And so that's a huge difference in our sexuality. I was particularly taken, and I hope you discuss, the difference between East German sexuality and West German sexuality, because there you have such an experiment with two control groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as a social scientist, this is one of those things where we look for natural experiments. And Eastern and Western Germany, when they reunified in 1990, was a perfect example of a natural experiment. So first of all, I want to say that this is self-reported data. There are always issues with self-reported data. And but the key thing is that the same questions were asked to both populations on either side of the former Iron Curtain. The other thing that's really key is that some of these studies were done prior to 88, and some of these studies were done after 89 and 90 when Germany was reunified. So one critique of the data that I've heard is that the women in Eastern Germany weren't being honest because they were, living in a totalitarian system and they weren't free to say what they really believed. But the fact that because this study was published and it, like West Germans, as you can imagine, were quite upset about it, it was replicated after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when East German women were free to say whatever they wanted to say. And the fact that these findings persist means that there's some, when you have a finding that you question the methodology for, you rerun the study. And the fact that the study was rerun and the same results were found tells us that there's some reliability to this data. So what are the specific numbers? The specific numbers are really interesting. So there are two things. One is they asked women the question, did you feel happy after the last time you had sex? So, this is a kind of vague, approximation of sexual satisfaction. But basically, did you feel happy? Well, here's the most fascinating thing. 82% of women in the GDR said they felt happy, compared to only 52% of women in West Germany. So that means that 48% of the women surveyed in West Germany were not happy after they had sex for whatever reason, right? The other thing that's really interesting is if you ask women, did your last sexual encounter leave you satisfied? Now, again, this is probably the proxy for did you have an orgasm, right? Did your last sexual encounter leave you satisfied? Well, in the GDR, which is East Germany, 75% of men and 74% of women said yes. But in West Germany, 84% of men said yes, but only 46% of women said yes. So there's an incredible discrepancy between sexual satisfaction of men and women. There's essentially like a satisfaction gap between East and West Germany. But the other thing that I think that's really interesting is about men and women's preferences for marriage. So one of the things that's really interesting is that in the former Eastern Germany, when people were asked, do you want to get married, right? 73% of men and 74% of women in the East, the socialist part of Germany, said yes, they want to get married. That's 3/4 of the people that you're, having relationships with are interested in marriage. Look at the difference between the West Germans, where 70% of women, 71% of women want to get married, but only 57% of men. And the reason that there's this really interesting discrepancy is, of course, because men in the West are supposed to be providers, and so they're constantly thinking of the economic considerations. Women, also thinking of economic considerations, want a husband who's going to be able to support her. Whereas in the East, women's economic independence, partially because of state investments in their education and training, part of because of women's higher rates of participation in the formal labor force, and very importantly, as you mentioned, Harriet, because of state commitments to kindergartens and creches and parental leaves and child allowances and a vast network of support for single mothers, means that women can enter into a relationship with a man on the basis of equality, and that she's not looking for somebody to support her. She's looking for someone to be her partner, to be an equal, to be somebody that she wants to spend time with or share her time with because she likes him and not because he pays her rent. I think that's really important to understand.
It's huge. But I worry a little bit about their emphasis on natalism, because I know part of women's liberation is to get women to the factories, because 14% of the Soviets were killed during World War II. They did need more workforce, and so did they in Eastern Europe. But I wondered what the pressure on natalism of having children exacted on sex in these countries.
Yeah. So that's a great question, because different countries had very different natalist policies at different times. And I would say that generally speaking, socialist governments and socialist theorists tend to be fairly pro-natalist. They tend to be fairly pro-family, partially because they actually do care when they ask what women think. And I can show you surveys done in women's magazines in Bulgaria from 1969 that show pretty clearly that women want children. And so the government took it upon themselves to provide for women so that they could combine their their reproductive roles with their productive roles in the labor force. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, with the exception of Stalin's Soviet Union between 1936 and 1955, so a specific band of time, Albania and Romania after 1966, almost all East European countries guaranteed access to abortion. The East Germans in particular were very early in liberalizing abortion, and they also had widespread contraceptive use in terms of oral contraceptives. Other countries had shortages around these issues. And for instance, in the Soviet Union after 1955, the primary form of birth control for a lot of Soviet women was, in fact, abortion. And so, despite the fact that they were very pro-natalist in their rhetorics, and I'm not for a second going to question that they were, because they were, most of these socialist countries believed that people were happier when they had families with children. That was just their sense of the world. But they did protect women's reproductive rights as much as they could. Now, there were moments when there were restrictions, but none of those restrictions were as strict as they were in the West. And in fact, if you go back to 1990-91 and you look at the reunification negotiations between East and West Germany, the entire reunification process almost collapsed over the issue of abortion because the East Germans had a much, much more liberal law than the West Germans. And still, to this day, actually, the West German, the now reunified German abortion law is stricter than it was before. So there's this interesting tension. They were very pro-natalist, and yet at the same time, they respected women's rights to control their fertility. And nowhere is this more apparent than what's happening right now in Poland. So in Poland, despite the fact that it was a Catholic country, despite the fact that Pope John Paul II was from Poland, right? Under the socialist government in Poland, women had access to abortion. And now, after the collapse of communism, what we see is incredible restrictions on women's reproductive rights, so much so that there are tens of thousands of women in the streets, right now, protesting these increasingly strict abortion provisions, right? So that now, under the new law, you can no longer terminate a pregnancy if your child has a genetic defect that is detected in your utero. This is a very, very controversial decision, and as I said, there are huge protests. But I think the other thing that I want to say to you is, and that I think is really important, and then I'll let you ask another question, is that the thing that we can see is after 1989 or 91, if we're talking about the former Soviet Union, birth rates plummet in Eastern Europe. In fact, I think of the top, 20 countries with the fastest shrinking populations in the world right now, 15 or 16 of them are in Eastern Europe, former socialist countries, where women have basically said, nope, no babies. The world is too difficult to have under capitalism, right? We can no longer be mothers. Whereas prior to 89 or 91, as fertility was declining, but nowhere near the incredible crash that we had, fertility crashes, what they call the demographic death spiral in Eastern Europe after 1989. I believe a colleague told me that in Eastern Germany, the birth rate in 91, 92 was the lowest it has ever been in the history of any society, not in wartime. And that shows you that fertility is very much related to the economic system. And one of the things that socialist governments tried to do was allow women the ability to combine motherhood and careers in a way that we've never really committed to in the West, outside of, as you said, some of these northern Scandinavian countries.
Now, that's really important. And it's particularly important because in the US, we've had a fertility crash as well. And we've had a fertility crash at the same time as the majority of women reject marriage because they don't want to have to work all day and then have the second shift of taking care of the chauvinist guy. And they don't want children because they can't afford it. It's too expensive. Childcare, after school care. summer care is much too expensive. And since the majority of women are now single, then, they'll have this expense by themselves. So you can see the relationship of fertility and support for women really clearly. Another thing I wanted to ask you, because your book is so important and so stimulating, is that after reading Baranskaya's short stories, which you mentioned and recommended in your book, and I avidly consumed because I loved your book and I still love it, is that one of the things that they did was enable women with childcare, but it still was the informal designation of women to do the domestic labor in the house. So even with their creches and their after-school programs and their summer programs and their support, they still were busy cooking and cleaning for everyone. And I wonder how they handled that one.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Julia, did you want to jump in? I saw you waving.
No, I always have 100 thoughts, but this is also fascinating. I'm just excited to, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so, I think that one of the things that's really important is that just because you had these state commitments to women's emancipation doesn't mean that you eradicated patriarchy. Patriarchy can still persist, and it did persist in Eastern Europe. That's one of the things that I make very clear in the book, that there was still, this what was called the double burden, where women were primarily responsible for the home, and men were never encouraged to quite the same extent as women were to take responsibility for the domestic sphere. However, I think that if you look at Eastern Europe, we're really only talking about 40 years. And so there was a lot of progress made in a very short period of time. So the scholar Mary Fulbrook reports a really interesting statistic. In 1970, they did a survey of men in the GDR, and they asked them whether they felt that married women's employment outside of the home would have adverse effects on family life. And 37% of men said yes. But only 12 years later, in 1982, they repeated that survey, and only 6% of men said yes. So within a 12-year period, right, there was this reduction of the men who saw women's employment as somehow problematic for the home. I do think that another book that I've written recently called Second World, Second Sex really looks at the role of state socialist women's committees. And they really did try to get men to help out in the home, but it didn't work. And for a variety of complicated reasons, which I can go into if you're interested. But I think that the key thing here is that, and I've had this conversation with my feminist colleagues in Eastern Europe, especially my socialist feminist colleagues in Eastern Europe. And when I have said, why didn't East European men step up? Why didn't they contribute more? I've been shut down by my East European colleagues who say that that's a bourgeois feminist ideal, that getting men to contribute at the home is imagining domestic work as a private thing. And that what socialist countries do and what socialism is supposed to do is to socialize this labor so that it's a collective endeavor to bring up the next generation. And that's why they invested in things like kindergartens and creches. Now, I have issues with that argument, partially because I think that, men benefit from spending more time with their children. And in fact, we also have very good surveys that show that sexual frequency, not necessarily sexual satisfaction, but sexual frequency increases among heterosexual partners when there's a perception of shared and more equitable distribution of housework in the home. That's a study that was done in the United States. And then another study with 1,338 German couples who'd been together for 5 years or more with children also report increased sexual frequency if there's a perception of more equitable distribution of childcare in the home. And again, because East German men are more likely to contribute, that means that couples with East German or former East German husbands tend to have more sex as well, which I think is really interesting. But I do think this is a really, feminists in the United States, and especially what we call liberal feminists, people like Sheryl Sandberg who want us to lean in, they spend a lot of time arguing about how we need to make men lean in, right? And I think it's, there is something to be said for having men lean in. But on the other hand, men have a lot of pressures on them too. And, we have a good 2017 survey from Pew, which shows that 70% of women and 72% of men say that it is very important for a man to be a financial provider in order to be a good husband or to be a good partner. And so as long as we are still putting pressure on men to be providers, so long as capitalism is still kind of cornering men into these particular economic functions in the family, it seems unfair to really blame them for not trying to contribute to the household when they're not going to get credit for doing so, I think, in our wider societal discourse. Yeah.
There are so many things that we need to discuss, and we are at the end of our time. But listeners and viewers, guess what? We're having a part 2 of this discussion coming up next, in the following week. So stay tuned. I am filled with thoughts and questions, and we've been speaking with Kristen Ghodsee. She's the author of Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence. Kristen, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And we're looking forward to having you on, for the continuation of this discussion. You're listening to Capitalism Hits Home. In January, Harriet and I will be starting, well, not January. We meant to start it in January, but as it turns out, it's probably not going to start until March. We're starting a 7-part series, the 7 basic human needs that should be protected from the capitalist marketplace. We'd like to hear what you think they are. We have our own ideas, so put them in the comments section underneath this video on YouTube. And don't forget that we do need your support. You can subscribe to our video. You can support us by sharing, by telling your friends, by texting this video out. You can also support us financially. And as we've been discussing over the course of the last few episodes, we are working to become fully self-supporting. I think when I joined the show, Democracy at Work, who is supporting this program, gave us 3 months to become fully self-supporting. And we're at 3 months and we're not quite there yet. So if you're thinking about giving money, now's the time. Go to our Patreon page, Patreon, and then Capitalism Hits Home. We're very thrilled that Democracy at Home has seen a rise in our viewership. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for viewing, and a rise in our financial contributions. So thank everyone who is making their contributions to us. So they are going to keep us going here on a weekly basis and give us a little more opportunity to hit those marks. So I do want to thank everyone so much for all of your contributions. Thank you, Kristen, for joining us. Thanks, Harriet, for your amazing, the questions and everything. I think we're at the end, so we will see you next time.
Okay, and special thanks to the people who worked on this. Brian Issam, Maria Carnamola, Anya, Liz Phillips, and the whole team at Democracy at Work. Thank you all. Bye-bye.